My name is Morgan Sterling, and at 32 years old, I realized that my family's love had a very specific price tag. Exactly $4 million. I am a senior software architect at a leading firm in Seattle, earning a steady $215,000 a year, but to my parents and my sister Sloane, I was nothing more than a convenient checking account with a pulse. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on, smelling of expensive rain-dampened wool and the lingering scent of the $85 diptyque baize candle burning on the counter. Sloane, 34 and perpetually dressed in quiet luxury brands like Loro Piana, stood over me like a vulture circling a fresh kill. She had never held a job for longer than 6 months, yet she lived in a $1.2 million condo in Capitol Hill that I had personally co-signed for. A mistake that now felt like a noose around my neck. Just sign the damn paper, Morgan. You're shaking so hard you can't even hold a glass of water, Sloane sneered, sliding the legal document across the cool, white-veined granite of the kitchen island. The paper was crisp, heavy bond stationery that felt alien under my fingertips. It was 11:42 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday, and the $14,000 island felt like an altar for my execution. My father, Arthur, a retired corporate lawyer who still insisted on wearing his $600 Breitling even to bed, stood by the window watching the rain lash against the glass. My mother, Eleanor, nervously smoothed her $1,200 silk La Perla robe, her eyes darting everywhere except toward mine. They weren't looking at me as a daughter. They were looking at the incapacity petition Sloane had drafted. It was a cold, calculated move to strip me of my legal autonomy and give Sloane full power of attorney over my assets, including my 401k, my investment portfolio, and the deed to my house. "We're doing this for your own good," Sloane added, her voice dropping into that faux sympathetic tone she used whenever she wanted something. Her eyes gleamed with the reflected light of the $3,000 Swarovski chandelier hanging above us. I didn't say a word. I just let my hand tremor, a rhythmic, subtle shaking of my right hand that I had spent 3 weeks perfecting in front of my bathroom mirror. This was the trap they had set for me, convinced that the high-functioning anxiety and minor neurological tics I'd reported after a fictional car accident were the beginning of an early-onset collapse. They wanted me declared unfit so they could liquidate my life to fund Sloane's failing boutique interior design business and my father's gambling debts at the Snoqualmie Casino. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to how we got to this kitchen at nearly midnight. 4 years I was the one who paid for the $4,000 family vacations to Maui, the one who covered the $800 monthly utility bills for my parents' sprawling estate when Arthur's investments went south, and the one who always picked up the tab at Canlis. I did it because I thought that's what family meant. I thought that if I provided enough, if I was stable enough, they would finally stop comparing me to the golden Sloane, who could do no wrong even as she drained their savings. But 3 weeks ago, I overheard a phone call between Sloane and my mother while I was in the guest bathroom. Sloane was crying about a $250,000 debt to a private lender, and Arthur's voice boomed in the background saying Morgan has it. She's just being stingy. If she won't give it to us, we'll just have to take the keys to the kingdom. Standing there in the kitchen, I looked at the pen, a heavy $450 Mont Blanc Meisterstück that Arthur had placed there with surgical precision. I felt the vibration of my phone in my pocket, a notification from my security system showing that my car, a 2024 Midnight Black Tesla Model S, was safely locked in my own garage miles away. They thought I was broken. They thought the shaking was my spirit snapping under the weight of my responsibilities. In reality, it was the only way to see how far they would actually go. The betrayal tasted like ash in my mouth, more bitter than the cold espresso sitting in my $60 Williams-Sonoma mug. I looked at Arthur, whose silhouette was framed by the dark Seattle skyline, and realized that to them I wasn't a person. I was a resource. And resources are meant to be mined until they are empty. I reached for the pen, my fingers dancing with that practiced, fragile wobble, and watched Sloane's lips curl into a triumphant smile that she didn't even try to hide. The air in the kitchen felt heavy with the metallic scent of rain and the cloying, sweet aroma of the $85 diptyque candle that seemed to mock the absolute wreckage of my trust. I stood there, watching the ink in the Mont Blanc pen shimmer under the Swarovski crystals, and I realized that the contrast in our lives was not an accident but a calculated insult carefully maintained by the people I called parents. My name is Morgan Sterling, and for the last decade, I have operated as a senior biomedical specialist for a classified military unit, A job that requires a level of psychological fortitude and technical precision most people can't even fathom. I earn $142,000 a year, a salary that should have secured me a life of luxury in any city in America, yet I stood in that kitchen wearing a pair of $45 tactical surplus boots and a faded thermal shirt while my sister prepared to steal the remains of my autonomy. While I spent my days in sterile labs or high-pressure field environments, I lived like a ghost, funneling every spare cent of my earnings into the Vance family trust. I had convinced myself it was my duty to cover the $82,000 out-of-pocket expenses for Arthur's quadruple bypass surgery at Johns Hopkins and the grueling $6,400 monthly mortgage on their 5,200-square-foot estate in the hills of Maryland. I drove a rusted 2012 Ford F-150 with a failing transmission and 190,000 miles on the odometer just so Sloane could maintain the illusion of being a lifestyle influencer. She was the golden child of a digital age, a woman with 400,000 bot followers who spent her afternoons filming staged morning routines in $1,200 Balenciaga track sneakers. I remember the day I saw her pulling into the driveway of the family estate in a pristine white 2024 Porsche Macan, the engine purring with a mechanical arrogance that set my teeth on edge. At the time she told me it was a gift from a brand deal, a reward for her hard work and aesthetic vision. It wasn't until I sat down to reconcile my operational pay accounts 3 weeks ago that the cold, hard truth hit me like a physical blow. Sloane hadn't earned that car. She had stolen it via a $95,000 unauthorized wire transfer from my primary savings account, a fund I had set aside for my eventual retirement from government service. My parents hadn't just watched her do it. They had facilitated it, convincing themselves that Morgan didn't need the money because Morgan was strong. Standing by the granite island, the fake tremor in my hand became almost real from the sheer vibrating force of my suppressed rage. Arthur continued to fiddle with his $600 Breitling, the ticking of the watch sounding like a countdown to my total erasure. He didn't care that I had sacrificed my youth to keep his lights on or that I had spent nights in combat zones worrying about his medical bills. He only cared about the optics of the sterling name and the comfort of the daughter who whispered sweet lies into his ear. Eleanor, my mother, finally looked up, but her eyes weren't filled with love. They were filled with the desperate greed of a woman who didn't want to lose her silk robes and high-end skincare routines. They were all complicit in this theater of the absurd, waiting for me to sign away my life so they could continue their masquerade on my dime. I looked at the legal document, the words incapacity and petitioner blurred slightly as I forced a shallow, panicked breath, playing the role of the broken soldier they desperately needed me to be. They wanted a victim, a weak link they could control and exploit until there was nothing left but an empty shell and a cleared bank account. But as my fingers hovered over the heavy bond paper, I knew that the classified training I had received wasn't just for the battlefield. It was for moments exactly like this, where the enemy isn't wearing a uniform but a silk robe and a smug, sisterly smile. I wasn't shaking because I was weak. I was shaking because I was holding back a storm that was about to level everything they built. My name is Morgan Sterling, a 32-year-old senior biomedical specialist for a classified military unit, and I have spent the last decade becoming a ghost in my own life to fund the delusions of people who share my DNA but none of my soul. I am a woman who understands the precise chemistry of survival, yet I stood in the center of a marble-floored ballroom feeling the cellular structure of my dignity dissolve under the judgmental gaze of 65 high-status guests. The betrayal reached its absolute, sickening peak during what Sloane called her foundation gala, a vanity project held at a private estate in the rolling hills of Great Falls, Virginia, which I had personally financed to the tune of exactly $22,400. I watched the money evaporate into artisanal catering from Relish, a $6,000 open bar stocked with Macallan 18, and a quartet of classical musicians who looked bored as they played Vivaldi for a crowd that was more interested in their own reflections. Among the attendees was even a senator's senior aide, a man in a $4,500 Tom Ford suit who was currently watching my sister transform into an executioner. Sloane was wearing a $3,800 archival Versace gown that I had bought for her under the guise of an emergency loan, her skin glowing with a $500 hydrofacial and the arrogance of someone who has never known the weight of a $45 pair of surplus boots. In a choreographed move of pure malice, she marched toward me and snatched my unlabeled medication bottle right out of my trembling hand. It wasn't just a bottle. It was an experimental neurostabilizer specifically formulated for my unit's high-stress endurance protocols, costing approximately $4,000 per dose and essential for managing the neurological tremors I had been faking to test their loyalty. "We don't allow sketchy, illegal pills at high-end events," Sloane announced, her voice projected with the practiced clarity of a theater major, ensuring every ear in the room caught the accusation. She held the bottle up like a piece of evidence before dropping it into a decorative brushed gold trash bin near the $14,000 granite kitchen island. I watched the plastic hit the bottom with a sickening hollow thud that echoed louder than the music. The room erupted into a wave of mocking, sophisticated laughter that felt like shards of glass against my skin. I looked toward my parents, hoping for a shred of the protection I had spent $1.5 million of my own life savings to provide for them over the years. Arthur just adjusted his $600 Breitling and nodded in silent agreement with his golden daughter, while Eleanor stepped forward not to comfort me, but to smooth her $1,200 La Perla silk robe as if my presence were a stain on the evening's aesthetic. "She's right, Morgan, you look off," my mother whispered, her voice laced with a cold, clinical disgust that hurt more than the initial slap of Sloane's words. They were all standing there, framed by a $3,000 Swarovski chandelier, essentially telling me that the person who kept their lights on and their hearts beating was an embarrassment to their manufactured prestige. But I'm getting ahead of myself because while they saw a broken daughter, I was seeing a target list being finalized. As I stood there, humiliated in front of a senator's aide and the elite of Virginia, I realized that the tremor in my hand wasn't just a performance anymore. It was the vibrating energy of a woman who had finally found the limit of her endurance. I had spent years driving a rusted 2012 Ford F-150 with a slipping transmission so Sloane could drive a $95,000 Porsche Macan she stole from my operational account, and this was the gratitude I received. I looked at the trash bin where my expensive lifeline sat discarded like common refuse, and I made a silent vow that by the time the sun rose over their 5,200 square foot estate, the Vance family trust would be as empty as their promises. Family isn't the blood that flows through your veins. It's the respect that remains when the money stops flowing, and for the Sterlings the bank was officially closed. I sat in my truck in the driveway at 2:15 a.m., the heavy Virginia rain drumming on the aluminum roof of my 2012 Ford F-150 with a relentless rhythmic violence that seemed to match the pounding in my chest. The cabin smelled of stale coffee, old upholstery, and the faint, ozone scent of a storm that had finally broken the humid Maryland heat. "My name is Morgan Sterling, a 32-year-old senior biomedical specialist for a classified military unit, and tonight was the night I finally stopped being a daughter and started being a strategist." I reached into my tactical bag and pulled out my encrypted military-issue Panasonic Toughbook, the ruggedized edges familiar and cold against my fingertips. There were no tears, no dramatic outbursts, and no more room for hope. There was only the data illuminating the dark interior of the cab in a harsh blue LED glow. I opened a local encrypted spreadsheet I had maintained for years, a document labeled Liability versus Asset that contained the true, unvarnished history of the Sterling family finances. Under the column marked Family, the balance was a staggering, absolute zero in terms of emotional equity. I scrolled through the line items, watching the numbers blur. I had saved them from total bankruptcy 14 times in just 3 years, a feat of financial gymnastics that required me to sacrifice my own dreams of homeownership and a stable retirement. My total investment into their survival stood at exactly $412,000, a sum that included Arthur's $82,000 heart surgery, the $6,400 monthly mortgage payments I made to keep their 5,200 square foot estate from the auction block, and the endless emergency loans Sloane used to buy her bot followers and $1,200 Balenciaga sneakers. The total return on that investment was now crystal clear. A public humiliation at a gala I paid for, the disposal of my $4,000 dose neurostabilizer into a trash bin, and a desperate, illegal attempt to strip me of my legal autonomy through a fraudulent incapacity petition. The irony was as sharp as a scalpel. They thought my tremors were a sign of a breaking mind, never realizing it was a controlled physical manifestation of the same precision I used to handle biological pathogens. I clicked a secure, double-authenticated link to my unit's legal and counterintelligence department, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat on the screen. The contrast between my life, this rusted truck, my $45 surplus boots, the quiet isolation of my service, and their lifestyle built entirely on the back of my labor, was a debt that could never be repaid with an apology. My father, with his $600 Breitling, and my sister in her stolen Porsche Macan, had mistaken my silence for weakness and my generosity for a bottomless well. They had finally crossed the perimeter. With a steady hand that showed no trace of the fake tremor I had used to bait their greed, I typed one single devastating sentence into the secure terminal. Initiate protocol honeypot. Asset compromise confirmed. As the command sent, I felt the digital gears of the military's legal machine begin to grind. A process that would systematically decouple my finances from the Vance family trust, freeze the unauthorized wire transfers Sloan had been leeching, and trigger a deep dive audit into the charity gala's funding. I watched the rain wash the dirt off the hood of my truck, realizing that by dawn, the $3,000 Swarovski chandelier in their foyer would belong to the bank, and the golden child would finally have to learn what a $45 pair of boots feels like. Family isn't a biological contract that grants the right to bleed you dry. It is a bond of mutual protection, and since they had chosen to become the predators, I had no choice but to become the hunter. The Sterling legacy was a house of cards, and I had just pulled the bottom row. The next morning, the Maryland sky was a bruised shade of charcoal as a persistent icy drizzle washed the grime of the previous night's betrayal off the windshield of my rusted 2012 Ford F-150. I wasn't heading to the military research facility in Fort Detrick. Instead, I navigated the morning congestion of the I-95 toward the heart of downtown Baltimore for a meeting that would dismantle the Sterling family legacy piece by piece. My name is Morgan Sterling, a 32-year-old senior biomedical specialist with a security clearance that would make my father's head spin, and I was about to prove that while my sister Sloan played at being a socialite, I had spent my career mastering the art of the clinical strike. At 9 a.m. sharp, I pulled into a reserved subterranean parking spot and stepped into the Mahogany Row office of Marcus Thorne, a forensic auditor who charged a staggering $900 an hour to find the bodies people buried in their bank statements. The office smelled of expensive Davidoff tobacco, aged leather bindings of old legal books, and the cold ozone scent of high-end air filtration systems that hummed quietly in the background. Marcus Thorne sat behind a massive desk carved from a single slab of African mahogany, his eyes shielded by a pair of silver-rimmed Lindbergh glasses that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. We spent the next 4 hours meticulously dissecting 48 months of bank statements from the Vance Family Trust, the very fund I had subsidized with my blood and sweat for nearly a decade. "She's been bleeding you dry, Commander," Thorne said, his voice as dry as the parchment he was highlighting as he pointed a gold-plated fountain pen at a $12,300 charge at a Chanel boutique on the Rue Cambon in Paris, dated precisely when I was supposedly loaning Sloan money for her thyroid medication. My jaw tightened as I saw the patterns emerge. A $15,000 marketing fee that was actually a down payment on her white Porsche Macan, and $8,400 spent at the Four Seasons Resort Maui while I was eating MREs in a containment tent. The financial theft was galling, but it was the moral bankruptcy that required the heaviest response, so I reached into my tactical satchel and handed Thorne a heavy manila folder. Inside were high-definition 4K screenshots harvested from the hidden motion-activated security cameras I had professionally installed in the family estate under the guise of an upgraded smart home system 6 months prior. The images were hauntingly clear, captured in the eerie green glow of night vision. There was Sloan sitting at that $14,000 granite kitchen island with a mid-tier probate attorney, her face twisted into a mask of pure greed as she pointed to a draft of the incapacity petition. The audio transcripts, which I had also included, detailed their plan to commit me to a state-run neurological facility in Western Maryland, a place where my shaking hands would be used as justification to seize my remaining $1.2 million military pension fund and the title to my primary residence. Watching my sister plot my digital and legal execution while my father, Arthur, nodded in the background, fiddling with his $600 Breitling, felt like a cold injection of paralytic. They weren't just stealing my money. They were attempting to erase my very existence to ensure they never had to trade their $1,200 La Perla silk robes for the reality of a working-class life. Thorne looked up from the folder, his professional composure cracking just enough to reveal a flicker of genuine disgust, and he asked if I was ready to proceed with the filing. I didn't hesitate. I thought about the $4,000 neurostabilizer bottle hitting the bottom of that trash bin and the mocking laughter of 65 strangers. But I'm getting ahead of myself because before the hammer could fall, I needed to see the look on their faces when they realized the broken daughter had been the one holding the remote control all along. Family isn't a safety net made of blood. It's a contract of loyalty, and once the Sterling family breached that contract, they ceased to be my kin and became nothing more than a liability that needed to be liquidated. The following Sunday, the Maryland sky was a piercing, mocking shade of cerulean, the kind of clear day that usually promises a fresh start but instead served as the backdrop for Sloane's ultimate act of hubris. She had organized what she called a success brunch to celebrate her self-appointed management role over the family estate, an event designed to solidify her transition from a leech to the undisputed sovereign of the Sterling legacy. By 11:30 a.m., the manicured gardens of the 5,200-square-foot estate were crawling with 40 of her most vapid associates, including a local real estate developer and several minor social media personalities who spent more time adjusting their ring lights than looking at the person they were talking to. The air smelled of expensive $150 bottles of Veuve Clicquot being popped every few minutes and the savory, charred aroma of Wagyu beef sliders topped with truffle aioli that I knew had been charged to the Vance Family Trust credit card. Sloane was holding court near the $18,000 limestone fountain, draped in a crisp $4,500 Dior bar jacket in cream wool and silk that clung to her with a precision she had never earned. She laughed, a high, tinkling sound that carried over the jazz quartet, her hand resting on the shoulder of a lawyer I recognized from the security footage as the one who helped draft my commitment papers. I didn't arrive in my rusted Ford F-150 this time. I parked my black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country at the edge of the driveway, the engine's low hum a stark contrast to the chirping of the socialites. I didn't come as the broken, shaking daughter they had tried to bury in a state facility. I stepped out of the vehicle wearing my full Class A Army service uniform, the dark blue wool pressed to a razor edge and my senior biomedical specialist insignia glinting in the midday sun. Every medal I had earned in the classified labs and high-stakes containment zones of Fort Detrick was polished to a mirror shine, pinned with mathematical exactness across my chest. As I pushed open the wrought iron garden gate, the heavy latch clicking into place with a definitive mechanical snap, the transformation was absolute. I walked toward the center of the lawn with my spine straight, my posture perfect, and my hands as steady as a master surgeon's during a delicate cranial bypass. The silence that hit the garden was instantaneous and heavy, a physical weight that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the air and stifle the music of the quartet. The senator's aide, who had witnessed my humiliation just days prior, froze with a Wagyu slider halfway to his mouth, his eyes darting between my medals and my face. Sloane's triumphant smile didn't just fade. It curdled, her tan turning a sickly ashen gray as she stared at the woman she had publicly branded as a drug-addicted hazard to society. Behind her, Arthur stood by the outdoor bar, his $600 Breitling catching the light as he dropped his crystal tumbler, the glass shattering against the flagstone with a sharp, discordant ring. Eleanor clutched her silk scarf, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and the sudden gut-wrenching realization that the daughter she had dismissed was a high-ranking officer of the United States military, a woman who held more power in her pinky finger than Sloane had in her entire bot-boosted empire. I didn't stop until I was standing exactly 3 feet from my sister, the scent of her $350 Maison Francis Kurkdjian perfume clashing with the faint metallic smell of my freshly pressed uniform. I let the silence stretch, savoring the way the guests began to whisper and pull back, sensing the shift in the atmosphere from a celebration to a tribunal. I looked directly into Sloane's eyes, noting the way her pupils dilated with pure, unadulterated fear as she realized the shaking hand she had mocked was now resting calmly at my side, capable of ending her charade with a single phone call. But I'm getting ahead of myself because the real show wasn't just my arrival. It was the fact that while they were drinking my champagne and planning my institutionalization, I had already signed the orders to evict every single one of them from the house I had bought with the years they stole from me. Family isn't a title you inherit. It's a standard you have to uphold, and as I stood there in the quiet of the garden, I realized that for the first time in 32 years, I was finally the only Sterling left standing. 32-year-old senior biomedical specialist with the kind of high-level military clearance that makes civilian life look like a poorly rendered simulation, and as I stood in the center of that pristine Maryland garden, I realized that the greatest experiment of my life was finally reaching its volatile conclusion. I didn't look like the broken, twitching ghost they had spent months trying to manufacture. I stood in my razor-sharp Class A uniform, my medals, the Meritorious Service Medal and the Army Achievement Medal, catching the harsh midday sun like jagged shards of glass. The silence that gripped the 40 guests was absolute. A vacuum of sound where the only thing audible was the distant rhythmic splashing of the $18,000 limestone fountain and the frantic shallow breathing of my sister, Sloane. She stood frozen in her $4,500 cream Dior suit, her tan looking like cheap stage makeup against the sudden deathly pallor of her skin as she realized that the shaking hands she had mocked were now perfectly still, holding a military-grade encrypted tablet with the steady precision of a sniper. I think there's been a misunderstanding about who owns the air you're breathing, Sloane, I said, my voice projecting with a cold, clinical resonance that carried effortlessly across the manicured lawn to the very edges of the 5,200-square-foot estate. I didn't yell because I didn't have to. The sheer authority of my presence was enough to make the senator's aide physically recoil as if I had struck him. With a single deliberate swipe on my tablet, I synced the device to the massive 85-inch Samsung Neo QLED outdoor television that Sloane usually used to loop her vanity-filled influencer reels for the crowd. Instead of her filtered face pouting at a camera, the screen flickered to life with a jagged neon blue spreadsheet that detailed every cent of the Vance Family Trust's destruction in high-definition clarity. The guests watched in a sort of paralyzed horror as the logs scrolled by. A $95,000 unauthorized wire transfer for a 2024 white Porsche Macan, $12,300 for a 3-day shopping spree at the Chanel boutique on Rue Cambon in Paris, and even the pathetic $4,000 she had spent on 200,000 bot followers to bolster her failing digital ego. The socialites held their $150 bottles of Veuve Clicquot like they were filled with poison, their eyes darting from the screen to the woman they had been toasted just moments before. But I wasn't finished because the financial theft was merely the preamble to the moral execution I had prepared. I tapped the screen again, and the garden was suddenly filled with the crisp, amplified audio of the security footage I'd harvested from the kitchen's 4K hidden cameras. Sloane's voice, stripped of its brunchtime sweetness and dripping with a predatory, calculated venom, filled the air. I want her in a care facility. I don't want her comfortable. I want the pension fund cleared by the end of the month. The sound of her conspiring with her lawyer to have me committed to a state-run ward in western Maryland hit the crowd like a physical blow, and one woman in a silk floral dress actually dropped her $30 plate of artisanal lox, the china shattering against the flagstone with a sharp, final crack. I looked past Sloane to where Arthur and Eleanor stood, my father's hand trembling so hard he had to grip the back of a wrought iron chair, his $600 Breitling glinting like a mocking reminder of the time he had wasted. They had watched their favorite child plot to bury their provider alive, and in their stunned, cowardly silence, I saw the true face of the sterling legacy. It wasn't built on honor or love, but on the parasitic consumption of the one person who actually gave a damn. I didn't feel sadness as I watched the socialites begin to set down their glasses and edge toward the gate. I felt the clean, cold satisfaction of a researcher who had finally isolated the pathogen. Family isn't the name on the deed or the blood in the donor bag. Family is the bridge that holds when the world tries to burn you down, and as the last of the Wagyu sliders grew cold on the table, I knew that the bridge behind me had already been reduced to ash. I wasn't just taking back my money, I was reclaiming the decade of my life they had treated like a disposable resource. And as the garden emptied, I realized that the only thing left of the Sterling family was the silence I had finally earned. A 32-year-old senior biomedical specialist with the kind of high-level military clearance that makes civilian life look like a poorly rendered simulation, and as I stood in the center of that pristine Maryland garden, I realized that the greatest experiment of my life was finally reaching its volatile conclusion. The silence that gripped the 40 guests was absolute. A vacuum of sound where the only thing audible was the frantic, shallow breathing of my sister, Sloane, who stood frozen in her $4,500 cream Dior suit. Her tan looked like cheap stage makeup against the sudden, deathly pallor of her skin as she realized that the shaking hands she had mocked for weeks were now perfectly still, holding a military-grade encrypted tablet with the steady precision of a seasoned operative. I think there's been a misunderstanding about who owns the air you're breathing, Sloane, I said, my voice projecting with a cold, clinical resonance that carried effortlessly across the manicured lawn to the very edges of the 5,200-square-foot estate. I didn't yell because I didn't have to. The sheer authority of my presence, backed by the glint of my meritorious service medal, was enough to make the guests physically recoil. I stepped closer to her, the grass crunching under my $45 surplus boots, which felt more honest than anything else in this zip code. The signature I gave you on that incapacity form? It's a honeypot marker, I told her, watching as the final remnants of her composure evaporated, leaving her looking like a cheap wax figure melting under the Maryland sun. The moment you tried to file that fraudulent document at the Montgomery County Courthouse, the Department of Defense flagged you for federal fraud and identity theft against a high-level active-duty operative. I saw the realization hit her like a kinetic strike, her eyes darting toward the driveway where, at exactly 12:04 p.m., two midnight black 2025 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country SUVs with tinted windows and government plates pulled into the circular driveway with a synchronized gravel-spraying stop. Sloane tried to make a break for the side gate, her movements frantic and uncoordinated, but her $1,200 Balenciaga track sneakers, which I had unwittingly paid for, betrayed her as they slipped on the wet, over-manicured grass. She tumbled onto the lawn, the cream fabric of her Dior jacket staining green as four stone-faced agents in tactical gear stepped out of the vehicles. My parents stood paralyzed by the outdoor bar, Arthur clutching his $600 Breitling as if the gold could protect him from the reality of his own cowardice. I reached into the pocket of my Class A tunic and pulled out a legal manila envelope, handing it to them with a hand that didn't tremble even a millimeter. "You have 72 hours to vacate this property," I announced, my voice devoid of the warmth I had wasted on them for a decade. "I've sold the house to a commercial developer who plans to raise the structure for a high-density complex. The mortgage was always in my name, and since the Vance Family Trust is now legally bankrupt due to your daughter's theft, the deed is officially in the wind." Eleanor began to sob, the sound muffled by her $1,200 La Perla silk robe, but I didn't feel a flicker of the old guilt that used to drive me to pull extra shifts in the lab. I watched the agents move towards Sloane, who was screaming about her followers and her brand while being read her rights in front of the very socialites she had tried to impress with my money. This was the true cost of their betrayal. Not just the loss of the $14,000 granite kitchen island or the $3,000 Swarovski chandelier, but the total erasure of the safety net they had spent years weaving out of my sacrifices. As the zip ties clicked shut on Sloane's wrists and the guests scrambled for their luxury cars, I realized that family isn't a biological entitlement to someone else's soul. Family is a fortress built on mutual respect, and when you decide to tear down the walls of the person protecting you, you don't get to act surprised when the roof finally collapses. I turned my back on the estate, walking toward my own truck with the heavy, certain gait of a woman who was finally, undeniably free. A 32-year-old senior biomedical specialist with the kind of high-level military clearance that makes civilian life look like a poorly rendered simulation, and as I stood in the center of that pristine Maryland garden, I realized that the greatest experiment of my life was finally reaching its volatile conclusion. The fallout from the success brunch was as surgical and cold as the experimental procedures I oversee at Fort Detrick, leaving no room for the messy, emotional reconciliations that people usually see in movies. By 12:45 p.m., the two midnight black 2025 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country SUVs were pulling away from the circular driveway, and inside one of them, my sister Sloane was experiencing the terrifying reality of a world that didn't care about her 400,000 bot followers or her $4,500 cream Dior suit. She was formally charged with 3 counts of federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft against a government operative, a legal nightmare that began with a viral mugshot, her mascara-streaked face looking hollow and desperate, which effectively ended her influencer career before the evening news even aired. The collapse of the Sterling dynasty was a controlled demolition that I had engineered with the help of Marcus Thorne, my $900 an hour forensic auditor, ensuring that every cent stolen was accounted for and every loophole was welded shut. Arthur and Eleanor, the parents who had once stood by while my sister tried to have me committed to a state-run ward, were forced to watch as a moving crew cleared out their 5,200 square foot estate within the 72-hour grace period I had granted them. They were relocated to a cramped, 700 square foot apartment in a dilapidated section of Baltimore that they used to mock during our $800 family dinners, a place where the scent of cheap pine sol replaced the aroma of $85 diptyque candles. My father's $600 Breitling was sold to cover his initial legal retainers, and my mother's $1,200 La Perla silk robes were packed into cardboard boxes that sat on a linoleum floor, a stark reminder that their lifestyle had been a parasite living off a host that finally grew a spine. I didn't wait around to watch them settle into their new, diminished reality. Instead, I took the final $1.2 million from my military pension and personal savings and moved it into a private, offshore diversified trust that was legally untouchable. I executed a total digital blackout, blocking every single one of their numbers and changing my primary contact information through the Department of Defense's identity protection protocols, effectively becoming a ghost to the people who shared my DNA. Now 3 months later, I wake up at 5 a.m. not to the sound of a frantic, manipulative phone call, but to the rhythmic, calming crash of the Atlantic Ocean against the rocks outside my new home, a quiet, glass-walled architectural marvel on the coast of Maine. I spend my mornings in a $140 charcoal gray cashmere lounge set, drinking a cup of $8 artisanal Kenyan coffee brewed in a Technivore Maca Master, staring out at a horizon that doesn't demand anything from me. The silence in my home is heavy and beautiful, a physical presence that validates every hard decision I had to make in that rain-slicked driveway in Maryland. I realize now that the $412,000 I spent saving them from bankruptcy 14 times wasn't an investment in family, but a ransom I was paying for a love they were never capable of giving. Success isn't measured by the $150 bottles of Veuve Clicquot or the $95,000 Porsche Macan that the government has since seized from Sloan. It is measured by the total, unshakable peace of a phone that no longer rings with lies. Family isn't the blood that flows through your veins. It is the loyalty that remains when the money stops flowing, and as I watch the sun rise over the cold Maine water, I know that the only person I ever truly owed anything to was the woman who had the courage to walk away. The sterling legacy is dead, and in its place, I have built a life of absolute, unburdened truth. As I sat in the silent, temperature-controlled cabin of my 2024 midnight black Tesla Model S, watching the digital clock flicker to 3 a.m., I realized that the greatest fiction ever sold to humanity is the idea that blood is thicker than water. I am a 32-year-old senior software architect specializing in encrypted neural networks, earning a base salary of $245,000 with a stock option package currently valued at $1.8 million. Yet for the last 5 years, I lived like a tenant in my own life to fund my sister Sloane's delusions of grandeur. Looking back at the 48 hours of absolute scorched earth chaos that led to this moment, the truth settled into my bones with the cold finality of a debugger finding a fatal error in a legacy codebase. Some people don't actually want to be saved or supported. They simply want to be the ones holding the leash, and my sister had mistaken my quiet tolerance for a collar. She thought she was the apex predator of our social circle, prowling through the high-end boutiques of Bellevue in $1,200 Balenciaga Triple S sneakers, but she had fundamentally forgotten who it was that actually trained the predators and built the world she was trying to conquer. I didn't lose a family today. I underwent a radical, necessary surgical procedure to cut out a malignant tumor that was costing me exactly $12,000 a month in chronic stress, unauthorized credit card sweeps, and the constant, vibrating anxiety of waiting for the next manufactured emergency. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and to understand the sheer scale of the betrayal, I have to take you back to the sterile, mahogany-walled office of my estate attorney where the mask finally slipped. Sloan had spent the last 18 months carefully curating a narrative that I was mentally unstable, using my high-pressure work schedule and the occasional late-night office light as evidence that I was losing my grip on reality. She wanted the keys to the kingdom, specifically my $4.2 million investment portfolio and the deed to our family's ancestral property in the Hudson Valley, a sprawling 12-acre estate with a 6,000-square-foot colonial home that I had personally renovated at a cost of $850,000. The contrast between us was a study in parasitic evolution. While I was working 16-hour days developing proprietary algorithms, Sloan was a lifestyle influencer with 500,000 bot followers, driving a white 2023 Porsche Macan that was registered to my primary business account without my explicit consent. She lived in a $6,500 a month penthouse in the Pearl District that I paid for, claiming it was her creative studio, while she used my $15,000 limit Amex Gold card to buy vintage Chanel suits and $400 bottles of Clase Azul tequila for people who didn't even like her. The injustice of it all culminated at my father Arthur's 60th birthday dinner at the Metropolitan Grill, where the bill came to $3,400 for 12 people. As I reached for my wallet, Sloane leaned over and whispered loudly enough for the entire table of investors to hear that maybe I should let her handle the finances from now on, given my recent episodes. My mother, Eleanor, didn't defend me. She just adjusted her $25,000 Cartier love bracelet, a gift from me, and looked away, her silence confirming that in the Sterling family, utility was the only metric for love. Now, as I drive toward the coast, the hum of the electric motor is the only sound in a world that used to be filled with their demanding, screeching voices. I have frozen every account, revoked every power of attorney, and triggered a forensic audit that will likely see Sloane answering questions from the IRS regarding $250,000 in unexplained income transfers. Success, I've realized, isn't just about the numbers on a Bloomberg terminal or the $8 artisanal Kenyan coffee I'll drink in my new glass-walled house on the cliffs of Big Sur. It is the absolute shimmering silence of a phone that no longer rings with expensive lies and desperate manufactured crises. Family is not a biological contract that grants a right to exploit. It is a bond of mutual protection, and when the bridge is rigged with explosives by the people you are trying to cross it with, the only logical move is to be the one who triggers the detonator first. I am finally free of the weight of their expectations, and as the sun begins to bleed over the horizon, I realize that for the first time in 32 years, the only person I am responsible for is the woman staring back at me in the rearview mirror. If there is one thing my career as a senior biomedical specialist has taught me, it is that a cornered predator is most dangerous not when it lunges, but when it tries to play the victim. The final, desperate blow of this civil war came 3 weeks after the eviction, when Sloane's new legal counsel, a cut-rate personal injury attorney operating out of a strip mall in Silver Spring, attempted to sue me for $1.5 million, citing intentional infliction of emotional distress. She claimed that my calculated repossession of my own life had caused her a nervous breakdown, yet the irony of her filing a lawsuit while standing in a 700-square-foot apartment she couldn't afford was a level of audacity even I hadn't predicted. I didn't bother with a countersuit or a lengthy deposition. Instead, I sat in the sterile, glass-walled silence of my new office and sent a single high-resolution encrypted file to her attorney's inbox. The file contained the clear, unedited 4K footage of the Foundation Gala, specifically the moment Sloane's fingers curled around my unlabeled, experimental $4,000 dose neurostabilizer and dropped it into a decorative gold trash bin with a smirk that was now immortalized in digital amber. I included the receipts from the military pharmacy and a sworn affidavit from my commanding officer detailing the life-critical nature of that specific chemical compound. The legal posturing collapsed with the speed of a controlled demolition. The case was dropped in exactly 15 minutes once her lawyer realized he was representing a woman who had essentially committed felony reckless endangerment against a federal operative on camera. The fallout since that afternoon has been a study in poetic justice that no amount of money could ever purchase. Sloane, the woman who once looked down on anyone who didn't wear $1,200 Balenciaga sneakers, is currently working a seasonal retail position at a suburban shopping mall for $16.50 an hour. Her days spent folding polyester blends and dealing with the very public she once considered beneath her. The white 2024 Porsche Macan she had stolen through that $95,000 unauthorized wire transfer was repossessed by federal marshals and sold at a local police auction for $62,400, every cent of which was diverted back into my primary operational account to settle her outstanding debts. My parents, Arthur and Eleanor, have discovered that the world is a very cold place when you no longer have a daughter to pay the $6,400 monthly mortgage on a 5,200-square-foot dream that was never yours to begin with. I recently received a notification that Arthur tried to pawn his $600 Breitling only to find out the internal movement was damaged, rendering it nearly worthless. A fitting metaphor for a man whose outward prestige was always hollow. I didn't feel a flicker of triumph as I deleted the final email from their shared account. I only felt the clean, antiseptic relief of a job finally finished. I have moved my life to a quiet stretch of the Maine coastline, where I wake up at 5 a.m. to the sound of the Atlantic and the smell of salt spray rather than the scent of $85 diptyque candles and betrayal. I spend my mornings drinking $8 artisanal coffee and watching the fog lift off the water, knowing that my $1.2 million pension is safe in my hands, for the first time in years, are truly and permanently steady. Family isn't a biological sentence or a bank account to be drained by the loudest voice in the room. Family is the quiet respect of those who stand by you when the gold stops shining. As I look out at the gray churning sea, I realize that the silence of a phone that no longer rings with lies is the most expensive luxury I have ever owned. My name is Morgan Sterling, a 32-year-old senior biomedical specialist for a classified military unit, and I have spent the better part of a decade acting as the invisible financial foundation for a family that treated my existence like a line of credit they never intended to repay. Standing on the weathered cedar deck of my new glass-walled sanctuary on the rugged Maine coastline, I can still feel the ghost of that $4,000 dose neurostabilizer bottle hitting the bottom of a trash bin, a sound that finally broke the spell of familial obligation. The air here smells of salt spray, wild pine, and the cold, bracing purity of the Atlantic, a stark contrast to the suffocating, artificial scent of the $85 diptyque baize candles that used to permeate my parents' 5,200 square foot estate in Great Falls. I looked down at my feet, still encased in the same $45 tactical surplus boots I wore when I was funding Sloane's $1,200 Balenciaga obsession and Arthur's $600 Breitling habit, and I realized that these scuffed leather soles have more integrity than my entire biological lineage combined. They are comfortable, durable, and a constant grounding reminder that while you can certainly pay to watch a complex lie fall apart, you cannot buy the kind of class that comes from earning every cent you own. The finality of the situation settled over me like the morning fog lifting off the jagged rocks below, revealing a landscape that was finally, undeniably mine. I had spent years driving a rusted 2012 Ford F-150 with a slipping transmission and 190,000 miles on the odometer just so Sloane could parade around in a white 2024 Porsche Macan that she bought using a $95,000 unauthorized wire transfer from my operational pay account. I had sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and my own neurological health to cover the $6,400 monthly mortgage on a house where I was treated like a drug-addicted hazard for the crime of having a high-pressure job. But the moment I initiated Protocol Honeypot and watched the Department of Defense flag my own sister for federal fraud, the power dynamic shifted with the violent precision of a tectonic plate. Life is significantly cheaper both financially and emotionally when you no longer have to fund a circus of parasites who view your success as their personal lottery winnings. Every morning at 5 a.m., I brew a cup of $8 artisanal Kenyan coffee in my Technivorm Moccamaster, listening to the absolute shimmering silence of a house that contains no one's filtered lies or manipulative demands. My remaining $1.2 million pension fund is safely locked behind a private offshore trust, shielded from the grasping hands of a family that tried to commit me to a state-run ward just to clear my bank balance. Sloane is currently learning the true value of a dollar while folding polyester blends at a suburban mall for $16.50 an hour, her influencer career buried under the weight of a viral mugshot and a federal indictment. Arthur and Eleanor are navigating the grim realities of a 700-square-foot apartment in a neighborhood they once mocked from the windows of the SUVs I paid for. I didn't lose a family during those 48 hours of scorched earth chaos. I underwent a necessary life-saving amputation of a malignant tumor that was costing me $12,000 a month in pure, unadulterated stress. As I watch the sun bleed a pale, watery gold over the horizon, I understand that family isn't a biological sentence or a blood-bound contract that grants the right to bleed a provider dry. True family is the loyalty that remains when the gold stops shining and the bank accounts are frozen, and since the Sterlings failed that basic human metric, they earned their exile. I have traded the Swarovski chandeliers and the mahogany row betrayals for the honesty of the tide and the quiet dignity of my own company. I still wear my $45 boots because they remind me of the miles I walked in the dark to get to this light, and every step I take on this deck is a testament to the fact that peace is the most expensive luxury in the world, and I finally have the receipts to prove it's mine. Success isn't a social media following or a stolen luxury car. It is the ability to look in the mirror and know that no one owns the air you breathe except you.